There was a morning in the spring of 2012 when Randal Plunkett walked out across the south field of his family's estate in County Meath and stopped walking. Not because he'd heard something unusual, not because anything moved. He stopped because nothing moved. Not a single cow, not a single tractor, not a single mowing machine threading its way between hedgerows that had been clipped within an inch of their lives for generations. The field was quiet in a way the Dunsany Estate had not been quiet in living memory. And across that silence, from somewhere in the knee-high grass beginning to push up through the old pasture, came the faint but unmistakable sound of something he could not immediately explain. He did not know what he was listening to. That is the important part. He simply knew it was different. The Dunsany Estate sits in the broad, low-rolling heart of County Meath, the ancient kingdom the Old Irish called Mide, the middle place. This is the land the Normans seized in the 12th century and never really left. The limestone-rich pastures stretching from the River Boyne south toward the Pale were among the most productive grazing territories in medieval Europe, and the English aristocracy that claimed them understood their value in the simplest terms: cattle, sheep, and the horse racing culture that made County Meath synonymous with Irish thoroughbred bloodlines. To look at the Dunsany Estate in the early 2000s was to look at a landscape performing the same agricultural role, more or less without interruption, since approximately 1180 AD. It was green, it was managed, it was, to every eye passing on the road from Trim to Dunshaughlin, entirely normal. That normalcy was the problem. Ireland presents one of the most extreme examples of deforestation in recorded ecological history. Before the first Mesolithic settlers arrived roughly 9,000 years ago, between 70 and 80% of the island was covered in native forest. Oak, ash, hazel, birch, rowan, and alder competed for light in dense canopies through which red squirrels and pine martens moved like shadows, beneath which soil teemed with fungal networks so intricate that scientists would later describe them as the nervous system of a living organism. By the 20th century, less than 1% of Ireland's original native woodland remained. The question of where the rest went is answered partly by history. Viking longships consumed Irish oak, Cromwellian campaigns stripped hillsides for charcoal, the iron industry devoured forests at a shocking rate. But the deeper answer is grazing. Continuous, generation after generation livestock grazing. Not a dramatic event, a slow, quiet process that prevented natural forest succession from ever gaining a foothold across every rolling hill in Ireland for hundreds of years. By the early 2000s, Ireland's managed grasslands were costing tens of millions annually in water treatment alone. Without woodland catchments, rivers ran brown with topsoil, and midland flooding increased. Pollinators collapsed, with some producers reporting crop losses of 20 to 30% before entomologists identified the cause. A landscape that no longer offered the plant diversity wild bees required to survive. The countryside looked healthy. It was not. It was performing productivity while quietly losing the biological complexity that made productivity sustainable. Randal Plunkett had not been thinking about ecology when he inherited stewardship of Dunsany. He is the 19th Baron of Dunsany, a title that sounds grander than it feels when you are standing in a field in November, watching rain move sideways across County Meath. The castle behind him, a Norman tower house expanded into something resembling a Gothic fantasy over several centuries, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited private residences in Ireland, and an unrelenting financial burden. Randal came to conservation not as an idealist, but as someone who had run out of better ideas. The estate's conventional agricultural operations were marginal. The farmland wasn't producing enough revenue to justify the management costs. Something had to change. What changed, beginning in 2011, was deceptively simple. The livestock were removed. The mowing stopped. The boundary management that had kept shrubs and grasses in a permanently juvenile state was largely abandoned. And then Randal Plunkett did something that ran counter to every agricultural instinct bred into Irish landowners over centuries of inherited practice. He waited. Within 18 months, the south field was covered in thistles. The north paddocks disappeared under shoulder-high nettles. Bramble canes arced out from the old hedgerows like reaching arms. and where soil had been most compacted by cattle hooves, dock leaves pushed through in dense mats. Neighboring farmers were not subtle in their opinions. Abandonment, they called it. Neglect. One local estimate suggested the estate was forfeiting several thousand euros per hectare per year by refusing to graze or crop it. Scotland. The ecologists saw something different. Birdwatch Ireland researchers visiting in 2013 began documenting what they described as an unusually rapid transition in bird community composition. Where heavily grazed fields had supported only a handful of generalist species, wood pigeon, rook, jackdaw, the transitional scrub was already attracting warblers. Whitethroat and garden warbler had moved into the bramble tangles. Stone chats were perching on tall thistle stems. Niall Hatch, a senior Birdwatch Ireland researcher who would return to Dunsany repeatedly over the following decade, recalls standing in the thistle field in autumn 2013 and realizing the estate's bird list had more than doubled in less than 2 years. Without a single bird reintroduced, without a nest box erected, without a supplementary feeding program established. The birds had simply noticed that the constant disturbance had stopped. But here is the first mystery, worth sitting with before reaching for an explanation. The birds arrived before the food did. Warblers and scrub specialists don't eat thistles, they eat insects. And in 2013, insect populations at Dunsany were still recovering from decades of intensive management. So why were the birds there? The answer, when ecologists pieced it together over the following 2 years, pointed to something most people overlook when they think about ecological recovery. It pointed to the soil. Beneath the compacted pasture, largely invisible, something had already been changing since the livestock were removed. Earthworm populations, suppressed for years by the physical compression of hooves and chemical inputs, had begun expanding laterally from the estate's older hedgerows. Beetle species requiring loose, aerated soil for their larval stages had started colonizing the old pasture margins. Ground beetles, rove beetles, dung beetles, species that had persisted in scraps of untreated hedgerow soil for years, were moving outward within months of grazing pressure being removed. The birds were tracking the beetles, long before a tree stood on the site, long before a single butterfly had found a flowering plant. The soil biology was the first domino to fall, and the birds felt it move before any human observer thought to look. By the summer of 2015, Trinity College Dublin botanists, conducting a formal vegetation survey, identified something that stopped several senior researchers mid-sentence. In the scrub field, where bramble and hawthorn had grown densest, beneath the thorny canopy that local farmers had spent 3 years demanding Randal remove, there were oak seedlings. Not planted, not nursery stock, wild oak seedlings, grown from acorns deposited by jays. The Eurasian jay, dismissed by most people as a noisy woodland scavenger, is in ecological terms one of the most important forest engineers in the temperate world. A single jay can cache up to 5,000 acorns in a single autumn, burying them individually across a territory spanning several square kilometers. Its memory is extraordinary, but not perfect. The forgotten caches germinate, and because jays preferentially cache acorns in open ground adjacent to existing scrub, precisely the habitat Dunsany's recovering paddocks had become, The estate was receiving a free, continuous tree planting service from a species that hadn't appeared on a single conservation management plan ever written for the site. What made the botanists pause was not the seedlings' presence, but their survival. In previous years, any seedling that germinated was eaten within days. Cattle and sheep moving across the estate for centuries had been extraordinarily efficient at removing woody plants before they could establish. But now something was protecting the seedlings. The bramble, the thorny, agriculturally despised bramble that had prompted 3 years of complaints from neighboring farms, was acting as a nurse plant, its dense canes creating a physical barrier that deer could not easily penetrate. The thistles and nettles were doing something similar, buying time, holding space, keeping the soil moist and aerated until the oak seedlings could establish root systems capable of surviving alone. The weeds were not the enemy of the forest. They were its first architects. This was the moment the scientific framing shifted. What had been called passive rewilding started to look like something more precise. The land was not recovering because someone had fixed it. It was recovering because someone had stopped breaking it. In October 2017, Niall Hatch recorded something at Dunsany that he later described as the moment he understood the estate had crossed a threshold. Standing at the edge of what had been the south field, barely recognizable beneath 6 years of scrub succession, he heard a great spotted woodpecker drumming. The great spotted woodpecker had been functionally extinct as a breeding species in Ireland for centuries. It had recolonized naturally from Britain beginning in the early 2000s. But its presence required dead-standing timber, large old trees whose heartwood provided nesting cavities, and the beetle larvae on which the birds fed through winter. Conservation bodies had long argued the species' slow recolonization was limited by the near-total absence of suitable woodland habitat. Dunsany's recovering scrub, already producing its first significant dead wood as pioneer trees began to senesce, had attracted one of Europe's most demanding woodland specialists within 6 years of grazing pressure being removed. No nest boxes, no supplementary feeding, simply the gradual accumulation of ecological complexity that follows when disturbance ends. What the woodpecker revealed was a principle ecologists sometimes call the ecological memory of a landscape. The idea is counterintuitive and easy to underestimate. Landscapes do not lose their biological potential simply because they lose their trees. The soil biology, the seed banks buried in the upper soil profile, the fungal mycelium networks that persist through decades of compaction, the hedgerow refugia, maintaining populations of species waiting for an opportunity to expand. All of this represents stored ecological capacity that conventional land management suppresses without erasing. Research published across rewilding sites in Britain and continental Europe suggested that sites with even minimal hedgerow remnants retained seed bank diversity far beyond what anyone had predicted. At some sites, seeds of woodland specialist plants germinated from soil cores taken in fields continuously grazed for over a century. The seeds had waited. In the dark, in the compressed soil beneath hooves and machinery, they had waited. When the pressure stopped, they germinated. At Dunsany, the first woodland wildflowers appeared in 2016. Wood anemone, one of the slowest colonizing woodland plants in the European flora, spreading through underground rhizomes at roughly 6 feet per century, emerged in a damp hollow near the estate's old walled garden, a hollow that had been grazed continuously for as long as anyone could remember. Its appearance told the Trinity botanists something the historical maps had not. that somewhere beneath the pasture, in the soil chemistry and fungal architecture of the ground, a memory of pre-agricultural woodland persisted. The forest hadn't been destroyed, it had been paused. By 2020, the estate's verified bird list had grown to over 90 species. Pine martens, Ireland's most charismatic native predator, absent from County Meath for decades, were confirmed on camera trap footage along the recovering scrub margins. Otters returned to the small stream draining the east field, a watercourse that had been running clear for 3 years since cattle were removed from its heavily trampled banks. Hedgehogs, which had declined by approximately 30% nationally between 1995 and 2015, were recorded in numbers that surprised experienced mammal surveyors. The estate had become a reference site, a place where people came not to see something that had been built, but to witness something that had resumed. The economic dimension of this recovery challenges assumptions that run deep in Irish agricultural culture. The dominant argument against rewilding is that land removed from productive agriculture generates no income and supports no families. At Dunsany, the picture that emerged was considerably more complicated. By 2022, the rewilded areas were attracting researchers, documentary filmmakers, conservation groups, and educational visits that generated revenue streams the conventional farming operation had never produced. Reduced management costs, no grazing contractors, no machinery maintenance, no fertilizer inputs, amounted to tens of thousands of euros saved annually. And neighboring farms had begun noticing something unexpected. Their soil moisture retention had improved. The recovering scrub was functioning as a natural sponge, slowing rainwater across the landscape and reducing the peak flows that had previously caused downstream flooding. A government program spending millions annually on conventional flood management along Meath's river systems was, in effect, receiving partial services for free from one man's decision to stop mowing a field. Nature, as one ecologist observed at a 2023 conference, does not invoice. The services it provides are real, they simply don't appear on any balance sheet. The question the Dunsany experiment left open, deliberately, because the researchers involved were honest enough to resist a tidy conclusion, was one of scale. The estate's recovering woodland, impressive within its own boundaries, remained ecologically isolated. County Meath is not a place where wildlife moves easily between habitat patches. The road network is dense. The agricultural landscape is intensively managed. The nearest native woodland is fragmented and small. What Dunsany demonstrated was that the ecological foundations remained intact beneath the grass. It did not yet demonstrate whether a fragmented series of such sites could reconnect into something resembling a functioning landscape. That is the unfinished question, and it is, in some ways, the most important one. Because what Dunsany ultimately suggests is not that rewilding is easy, or that it works everywhere, or that it can substitute for active conservation programs that genuinely endangered species require. What it suggests is something simpler and more unsettling, that across much of the temperate world, the ecological crisis is not primarily a problem of destruction. It is a problem of interruption. The wildflower meadows, the insect-rich grasslands, the functioning river systems that ecologists have spent decades trying to rebuild at enormous cost. In many cases, they were not destroyed. They were interrupted. The seed banks still hold their dormant potential. The fungal networks still thread through the soil. The animals still exist in fragmented refugia, waiting for a corridor that hasn't opened yet. The question is not whether nature can recover. The question is whether we will stop interrupting it long enough to find out. The deer that Randal Plunkett watches from his window in the evenings are not afraid of him anymore. Not the woodpecker, not the pine marten on the camera trap, not the wood anemone appearing in a field grazed within his own memory. What surprised him most was the deer. Wild fallow deer that would once have bolted at the sound of a gate latch now graze calmly in the recovering meadow, unhurried, their heads lifting occasionally to test the air, before dropping again to the grass. Something in the landscape had communicated to them that this particular piece of ground had changed. That it was safe. It took 8 centuries to break it. It took 11 years to hear it breathing again. The recovery at Dunsany is not finished. It may not be finished within any human lifetime currently observing it. The oak seedlings that Jays planted in 2013 and 2014 will need another 60 years to reach the canopy height that great spotted woodpeckers prefer for nesting. The fungal networks reconnecting beneath the recovering soil are operating on a timescale that has nothing to do with annual reports or grant cycles. The story is not over. In the most honest sense, it has barely begun. What we know, what the cameras recording and the researchers surveying and the Baron watching from his window all know, is that it is happening. Right now, beneath the scrub and the bramble and the nettles that every neighboring farmer still shakes his head at, something enormous and ancient and deeply patient is rebuilding itself. That is the thing about ecological memory. It doesn't need to be reminded of what it is. It only needs to be left alone long enough to remember. If what you've just watched has changed the way you think about the land outside your window, if you're looking at that overgrown corner of a field, or that untrimmed hedgerow, or that patch of nettles in a ditch with slightly different eyes, then this story has done what it was meant to do. This is only one of thousands of landscapes around the world where the same question is waiting to be asked. Where, beneath the managed surface of things, something is waiting for the interruption to end. The forest didn't disappear. It was just holding its breath.